let me get started. So the topic is two-player zero-sum differential games with one-sided information and state constraint, aka football. Sorry to disappoint you. I mostly give this talk in US. So this is how I get students to come to the talk. So yeah, football, regardless if it's American or not, it's a two-player game, and it's zero-sum because there's a winner, there's a loser. It is differential game because it happens in continuous time. It also has continuous action space and state space. It is a game with one-sided information in the sense that the attacker have in their mind some attacking pattern, for example, attacking left or right. And the defender only has some ideas about all the possible ways the attacker is going to attack and some probability distributions over all the game types. And during the interaction, they're going to try to update their belief about which game is exactly being played and try to adapt their strategy according to that. All right, so I want to focus on this initial motion of the receiver who eventually got the touchdown, and he played it again. Because of this is a zero-sum game with information asymmetry, the attacker tries to take advantage of the information by sometimes playing these so-called belief manipulating moves or deceptive moves, right? So here you see that this guy moves to the left and quickly moves to the right. Now you would ask how important this strategy is by pairing this deceptive motion. This is something that we want to know, and I want to know how to compute them if they exist, right? You can take advantage of them. And we know that there are many wrong ways of doing it. So, right, if you have seen this movie, I don't know, I'm getting old. So, yeah, you did. yeah, okay. So we're gonna start from the formal definition of the problem, which is to compute a Nash equilibrium for football. Works for soccer as well. And then we'll talk about the current state of the art and the limitations and talk about some insights on how we can address these limitations. And then move on to open
demonstrate
questions.
that we know the solution. Really, we don't want to say something and then go back.
What was that?
I have no idea. Was that a question?
No, someone opened their mic, sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Someone
opened their mic, it's okay.
Oh, okay.
By the way, if there's any questions, feel free to open your mic and interrupt and ask, right?
Yes. Okay, yeah, please ask your questions. Okay, let me get started. So here's the definition of the game that we are solving. I will explain the elements and then also use poker as an example because this is something that I guess most people are familiar with. So starting with the state space, we have a joint space for all the players. In poker, this will be all the cards that you can see on the table and the bets that has been made. So everything public forms the state space. And then you have an action space for the players. In poker will be full chat bet called raise. And there will be a fixed time horizon. And here are the elements related to the information. So first of all, there's a number of payoff types. So you can imagine that there are number of possible games that's being played. And in poker, if you just treat it as a one-sided information, say one player has his private cards and the other player don't. Let's just say that's the case, right? Just make it simple. Then you can count the total number of possible combinations of cards in your hand, which is over 1,000. So the total number of possible payoff tables you can have is that number, right? Because the way we define the payoff is by combining the cards in your hand and also the cards on the table, right? That's how you can determine how much you're gonna get paid. All right, so in general, you have terminal payoffs, which are the amount that you're gonna get paid at the end of the game, looking at the terminal state of the game. And there's gonna be instantaneous payoffs that occurs during the game. For example, in control, if you care about the stability or track keeping of a drone, then those will become the instantaneous payoffs that you care about, right? And on top of this, since there are multiple games that could be played, for the player who has no information on exactly which game is being played, he will form this so-called public belief on top of the finite number of games, all right, which is P0. And then we'll say that this belief is public in a sense that everyone knows about this. So there will not be a situation like someone say, oh, I thought you love me, and the other guy say, oh, I know you, I thought you know I don't love you. So there's no how to say discrepancy between the belief of the players in the game. All right, so the belief is synchronized, if that makes sense. So at this moment, do you have any questions on the definition of the game?
How many players? Just 2 players?
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, it's going to be 2 player.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Or 2 team.
Or 2 teams. Okay.
All right. So this is how the game will be played. Before it starts, both player will compute their strategies. So for player 1, which we will assume as the informed player, so he knows which game is being played, he will prepare one strategy for each of the game that is being played. And for player 2, which we assume to be the non-informed player, so he will prepare one strategy for all the games, because to him, he doesn't know which game is being played, right? So he only has one strategy for the entire game. All right. And by strategy, it is going to be a probability distribution over the action space conditioned on 3 elements. One is time, right? At what stage of the game this is. And the second is the public state, which is for poker, all the cards that you see on the table, right? And the third thing is the public belief, which is what do you believe the cards will be on your opponent's hand, all right? So, and then once this is computed, nature will choose the type of a game and tell this information to player 1. So in poker, it will be dealing the cards, right? And player 2 will only know the public belief. And then the game starts. So at any stage of the game, players will choose their actions according to their strategies. So random draw from that distribution. And with these action pairs, you will evolve the state of the system according to some ordinary differential equation for control problems or for some Markov process if it's a discrete time version of the game. All right. And belief will be updated based on the Bayes rule accordingly. So both things are changing, right? The public state is changing. The public belief is also changing. And at the end of the game, you look at the trajectory of your interaction from where you can compute a payoff, which is something that player 2 will pay to player 1. So usually we say that player 1 is maximizing something and player 2 is minimizing something. But in control, it's the opposite. So sometimes you see I say player 1 is minimizing something like here. So the value of the game in the end is defined as the minimax over the expectation of this payoff. So the expectation is taken over the distribution of all the possible games. And the minimization is taken over the strategy space of player 1 and the maximization over the strategy space of player 2. Please keep in mind that in general, these strategy space are for random strategies because usually the Nash equilibrium exists in a mixed strategy space. All right. Any question at this point? Good.
No, you can assume we're
Okay.
fine unless we
Okay.
interrupt you. Yeah,
Okay. So then the objective is just to solve this minimax problem. I will note in passing that not always that we have a Nash equilibrium or the value exists for the game, but for the games that we are solving, there has been proved that the value exists. So you don't have to worry about that. Okay, so now let's talk about the limitation of existing approaches. So commonly what people do is to form the game as a game tree. And I will use rock, paper, scissors as an example. So starting from the root node, player 1 will choose his actions, right? So there's 3 actions he can choose. And by choosing one action, you move on to the child node, where player 2 will choose his actions, and then it leads to a payoff in the end, right? So first of all, the complexity of the game can be measured by the number of leaf nodes or number of passes along the tree. So in this simple rock, paper, scissors example, the complexity will be 9 because there's 9 leaves in the end. And the second thing is that there are parts of the nodes that cannot be distinguished by some other players. So for example, here, player 2 cannot distinguish these 3 orange nodes because when player 2 makes his decision, he really doesn't know what has been played by player 1 because it's played in player 1's mind, right? So these nodes cannot be distinguished by player 2, and we call that a info state. So player 2 has to make a decision based on two things. One is what's on the table that has been seen, and the second is his belief about which game is being played, right? What the information that's missing according to him, right? So this is a info state for player 2, and then he will have to make a decision based on the beliefs. All right, that's the nature of the game. Okay, so this game actually has been solved regardless how difficult it is. And here's an explanation. So you can look at this table here where the rows are the actions that can be played by player 1, rock, paper, scissors, and the columns are the actions that can be played by player 2, right? And eventually you're gonna come up with some probability distribution over all the actions, right? And then for each of the action pair, you have a consequence. This is how much player 2 will pay player 1, right? So you can imagine if you want to minimax the expectation actually has this bilinear form. So it's going to be eta, which is the distribution for player 1, and then zeta, which is the distribution for player 2, and all of the this matrix, right? Payoff matrix in the middle. Yeah. So all of the games of this type can be formulated into this bilinear form, which we know can be solved through linear programming. So that's the end of the story. Except that if you solve the problem this way, you will see that this is not scalable. Because, for example, for poker, the size of this matrix is going to be in the order of 10 to the power of 161. Okay, so it's just it's a linear program, but it's too large to solve. All right. Then a lot of the efforts has been spent on reducing the game down. And one of the most significant contribution is counterfactual regret minimization, which in simple words is just that is the idea that instead of solving the whole game, we can actually solve sub-games from bottom up, right? If you cannot solve the whole game, you can start by solving the end game. And then once you know what you need to do at the end game, you can take one step back and say, okay, what do we do at the second to last step, right? And so on and so forth, right? Okay, and then by doing so, you're gonna solve not just the distribution over all the possible sequence of actions, but something called behavioral strategy, which is the distribution at every node along the tree. There, to find the behavioral strategy, you will try to minimize the counterfactual regret, which is basically the gap between the strategy that you have been using versus the best strategy you could have used if you play the game again, okay? So naturally, you can see that by pressing that gap, right, which is a regret, down to 0, you find the Nash equivalent. There's a proof there that says that, yeah, by doing so, you find the Nash equivalent for 2-play zero-sum games. The complexity of this type of algorithm is linearly related to the size of the action space. So the larger your action space is, the slower it will be to solve each sub-game. And also the total number of games that you will need to enumerate over the tree is going to be exponentially growing with this size of the action space. Regardless, this type of algorithm is so far still the state of the art for solving these large games like poker. With combinations of, with the help from deep neural networks for approximating values and policies, and also efficient search along the tree. Okay, so then with this type of technique, we can solve poker in 2021, and then we solve even larger games like Stratigo in 2022. But the issue is that if you want to expand it to these differential games with continuous action space, then quickly this becomes not scalable. So that's the first limitation of the current algorithms. And the second one, which is also computational, is that these algorithms still are too expensive. So for CFR, counterfactual regret minimization type of algorithms, there's a proof that they don't converge. What's convergent is the average policy that you compute along the way. So that means that you will have to store all the intermediate neural network models that represent your intermediate policies, and then in the end, somehow averaging over all of your models. That's the thing that converges. And there are last iterate convergent algorithms, but they are very slow. So these, I'll skip the details of this, but overall, what I'm saying is that either you require large space to store all the policies, or it takes a lot of time to converge to the Nash equilibrium for these type of algorithms. All right. The third issue is a theoretical one. So far, value existence has been proved for two-player zero-sum games with state constraint. This is done on the control side, and also for games with incomplete information. This is done on the applied math side. But there hasn't been a proof value existence for games with both incomplete information and state constraint. So this is a contribution of our SML paper this year, where we proved the value existence, also derived the Hamilton-Jacobi equations and aligned the Nash equilibrium for this type of games. So this is necessary because a lot of the applications, including football and the missile defense, you have this situation where player 2 really wants to tackle player 1, right? So or in other words, player 1 really wants to avoid violating certain state constraints. So that shapes the policy differently from games without these state constraints. All right, so these are the limitations. Now let's talk about some insights on how we solve them. So the first thing, which is the most important, is that instead of looking at these game trees now with infinitely wide branches because of the continuous nature of these action spaces, you can actually prune the tree down significantly to find a solution with which is much smaller hypothesis space. So let me explain by using this normal form game setting. So this is a setting where both players play to either one of these two game payoff tables, and only player 1 knows that the actual game being played, for example, is game 1 on the left. All right, and player 2 only knows some distributions over these two game tables that is being played. And in each round, both players will choose their actions. So player 1 can choose A or B, player 2 can choose L or R. And once chosen, there will be a consequence, right? For example, player 1 will, let's say player 1 choose A and player 2 choose L, then player 2 will pay player 1 $1, let's say, right? The actions will be revealed after each game, but the payoff will not, because if you reveal the payoff, then player 2 can infer quickly which game is being played, right? So now this game will be played infinite number of stages, and eventually player 1 will receive the average payoff across all the games. So now let me ask you, if you are player 1 and you know that the game being played is the one on the left, what action do you play? A. Okay, so if you are player 2 then, and you see that player 1 plays A, what's your reaction? Yes, right. So now if you're player 1, do you think there's a better strategy than playing A?
Without going to G2?
Without, yeah. The game that's being played, you know, it's the first game.
No, you don't lose.
But
unless you're trying to go to B to DC.
Well, but if you keep on playing A's, and quickly player 2 knows, and so you know that the nonsense.
So you have to play B just to.
Yeah, you're gonna so you can prove that in this example, player 1, the best way to play is actually play as if he also doesn't know which game is being played. Right. Okay. So this is something called a non-revealing game. You're not revealing your information. Right. Player 2 cannot get anything out from the way you play.
How often?
Okay. So that's a good question. So now if you look at this game, now you know that player 1 will play non-revealing. That means that both player, you can imagine that both player plays this average game, right? So the payoffs are just the expectations over all of the games, right? So now this becomes a complete information game, and you can use LP to find quickly the Nash equilibrium, the mixed strategy for both players, and you'll find out that the value, which is expected pay, from player 2 to player 1 is this function here, which is a concave function on the belief space, right? In this case, belief is just one number. So if p equal to 0, it means that the game being played is the first one. If it's 1, it means that's the second one, right? So anywhere in the middle, it means that there's some uncertainty about which game is being played. So you will see that, yeah, if you reveal the information, which is, for example, you keep on playing A for the first game, then quickly the belief, let's say somewhere in the middle, will collapse to 0 and 1. Okay, will collapse to 0 and 1. And in expectation, you get 0, right? Which is this blue line here, right? So as a matter of fact, any belief manipulation, which will be some lines under this concave function, will be a worse payoff than if you just play as non-revealing, right? So this will be a game where player 1 will not be willing to reveal the information if the value is concave in this case, if he's trying to maximize the value. So the point, this is the most important point. Whether you reveal the information or whether you manipulate the belief of the other player is really related to the convexity of the value function in the belief space. So now here's another example, right? With this payoff table, let's do the same thing again. You compute the value for the non-revealing game across the belief space. Now you see that there's a dip in the middle for player 1, right? So if the common belief, the public belief, starts at somewhere in the middle, now you know that there's a chance for player 1 to play a mixed strategy to shift the belief of player 2 to these two vertices, in which case you're going to receive in expectation a higher value than if you just play in a non-revealing way. So this is where player 1 is willing to manipulate the belief of player 2 to get advantage of it. Does that make sense? So belief manipulation is from a mathematical perspective is a convexification or concavication in this case of the value function. All right. And then you can show how you can do this, right? Player 1 will craft a strategy, so which will be these numbers, right? If the game being played is the first game, there's some probabilities, and if it's the second, there's a probabilities. You can compute out exactly what these numbers are, so that by taking actions, player 2 will either switch to this belief or switch to the other belief if player 2 follows Bayes' rule to update his belief. Okay. All right. So now, and now you know that to find this type of mixed strategies to manipulate the belief, how many actions do you need? As a matter of fact, you only need at most I actions, because to convexify or concavify in this case, this value function in an I-dimensional simplex, right? So here we have a 2-dimensional simplex, which is just a 1-dimensional line. You only need I number of, we call it splitting points, or these vertices to convexify it. Yeah. So in this case, you only need 2 points to convexify a 1-dimensional function. Right? So in general, you need I points. So what it means is that even if you have a continuous action space, but if you need to play this belief manipulation, or if you really need to release the information, which is the extreme case in belief manipulation, right? The number of actions that you can possibly play is going to be at most I, not infinite. So you're not going to have you're not going to have a distribution over the continuous action space, but instead your distribution is going to be atomic on top of I actions. Okay, so this is beneficial to know if I, which is the possible number of games that could be played, is much smaller than the size of your action space, right? It's particularly the case if the action space is infinitely large, if it's continuous, all right? So that's one thing. But after you play this move, right, you can take advantage of the non-convexity of your value. What's next? Well, in general, the next thing you're gonna do is still gonna be a mixed strategy over the entire continuous action space. So, for example, in poker, that's the case. That's still not good, right? But the next thing, which is kind of trivial from a control perspective, is that you can show that in control problems or differential games, if the value is convex, then you're gonna just play one action. So so here we're gonna use the Isaac condition, which basically says that if you're playing a non-revealing or complete information game, then your Nash is gonna be pure, meaning that both players are gonna take just deterministic actions rather than distributions over this action space. So then, yeah, this leads us to this picture here. In the end, you don't need to search for distributions over continuous action spaces as your behavioral strategy. Instead, you're gonna have either a case where you split to at most I actions, or if your value is already convex, then you're gonna have a deterministic action, just a pure action to take, right? It's a much smaller tree, and it's no longer, the complexity of searching this tree is no longer related to the size of the action space. It's only related to I, which is the number of possible games that's being played, right? So this is not really beneficial for things like poker, because in poker, this number I is already too large, yeah. But if you have other games like missile defense, where you know that the possible targets are only, say, 2, then you can reduce the tree down significantly and only search in a much smaller space for the strategy. All right. Yes.
I'm sorry. I'm not quite understand this, but I'm thinking that is that possible multiple equilibrium can have a play?
So yeah.
Maybe you want to repeat the question. I don't know
Yeah, sure. The question is, would there be multiple Nash equilibriums for games like this? So in general, yes. For the games that we saw, which is 2-player zero sum, and with Isaac's condition, you only have a single Nash equilibrium. There's a unique Nash equilibrium. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's now go to the second limitation, which again is the fact that the solvers either require large space or cost, or they're very costly to solve, very slow to converge. Here the insight is that with Isaac's condition and the fact that the game is one-sided, one player has full information, the other one doesn't, we can actually decouple the computation of the Nash equilibrium of the 2 players. So the Nash equilibrium can be solved in parallel, meaning that when you solve the Nash equilibrium for player 1, you don't care about the equilibrium strategy for player 2. You only need the best response from player 2. Okay, so I guess I will skip some details and then directly look at the algorithm for solving the strategy for player 1. So eventually it will be some sort of Bellman backup, just like in reinforcement learning. You will have the current value, right, which is something about your future value, the value of the next time step, right, if you discretize time. And what you're minimaxing here, for the minimization part, you're solving the Nash equilibrium for player 1. So this is how you're gonna split, whether it's beneficial to split, to have a mixed strategy, or there's a pure strategy that's already the best, right? And then the maximization part is just the best response from player 2. And since this is best response, it's always a pure strategy. It's not going to be a mixed. Yeah. So yeah, this is a much lower dimensional problem to solve than if you solve for the Nash equilibrium in a continuous action space, right? Which will be, two functions over the continuous space, right? Okay. But the drawback of this is that you only find the Nash equilibrium for player 1, but not for player 2, because player 2 is playing the best response, which cannot be treated as the Nash equilibrium, right? Okay, so what we do then is to introduce convex conjugate of the value, which basically allows you to flip the minimax. So instead of looking at the best response of player 2 to player 1's Nash equilibrium in this dual game, you're going to look at the best response of player 1 to player 2's Nash equilibrium. So this way you can find the Nash equilibrium of player 2, but in general for a different game, which is the dual game. But then there's some conditions that you can satisfy, and then once they are satisfied, you can show that the two games have the same Nash equilibriums. So eventually, for player 2, he's solving this dual game, and then by solving it, it is guaranteed that his Nash equilibrium for this dual game is also the Nash equilibrium for the original game. Okay, so now I guess we can skip the math, but just look at intuitively what this means, right? The dual game. So here you have these Qs, which represents the payoff that player 1 will receive should he play the best response to player 2's Nash. So basically, these are the consequence. This is how much player 2 will have to pay to player 1 if both players play with their best effort. So player 2 has that information in his mind, and he's trying to minimize this gap between the actual strategy he's playing versus the best strategy he can theoretically be playing. Okay, so this maximization over this this quantity here, the gap, is essentially the maximum risk player 2 is going to take for across all the games that could be playing. Okay, so he's minimizing the maximum risk of all the games that could be playing. Okay, so there's a geometric interpretation of that, but I think to best understand this, let's just look at penalty. So player 2 in this case will be the goalie, right? Because he doesn't know which corner the kicker will kick. Yeah. So before the kicker released the information, which is to kick the ball, what's the best action for the goalie? Does he move left or right or stay in the middle? Stay in the middle. Why? Because that minimizes the maximum risk. All right. So that's a dual game. That's a game that from player 2's perspective, right? He's playing. Okay. So then yeah, you have similar to player 1, you have this Bellman backup thing, kind of thing, where you find the value, and then from there you find the policy. All right. So lastly, the third limitation, I would simply just say that we prove that the value actually exists for this type of games where you have one-sided information and it is state constrained. Okay, and it leads to the following very simple solution. First, you compute something called backward reachable set. So backward reachable set is basically a set within which you have time and state, and if you're already in this time and state, then there always exists a strategy of player 2 to tackle any strategy of player 1. Within this set, player 1 will not be able to escape from player 2. Okay, that's the set, right? You can compute that region. So if you're already into this region, then player 2 just surrender. You're always gonna get tackled by player 2. Okay, and then you can with this information, you can now solve the game outside of that region, right? But taking into account the fact that you don't want to get into the region as player 1. So that puts like an action sort of constraint at each time and state in a space so that you don't get into that region, because if you get in there, player 2 will tackle you. All right. So that's the solution to that. So here's the summary, right? The first thing is the most important, which is that we find out that for this type of games, if Isaac condition holds, then the computational complexity of solving the game is not related to the size of the action space. And then the second thing is if it's one-sided information, then you can decouple the Nash equilibrium for player 1 and player 2 and solve them separately by introducing the primal and dual games. And the third is that we identify the Hamilton-Jacobi equations for the state constraint games, and then now you can solve these games. So on the validation side, we only have done very simple cases. So I'm going to introduce Hecksner's game. So in this game, there are two players, and player 1's goal is to reach one of the two targets, and player 2's goal is to figure out which target player 1 is reaching and try to get there as well. So player 1 actually the terminal cost function is going to be convex, so that player one actually prefers not to let player two know where the goal is. So if both players are far away from the goal, but player two is further away from the goal, player one is actually very happy, as opposed to if both players are close to the goal. So yeah, so with that nature of the problem setting, player one the strategy of player one is actually to wait for a certain amount of time, as if he also doesn't know where the goal is before he reached the goal. So this is similar to penalty kick again. So before you kick the goal, you want to move in such a way that the goalie cannot guess which corner you are kicking, right? But once you get to the goal, you kick quickly. Okay, all right. So we use this game. Yes.
In this game, do they move at the same speeds? We want P2 always just replicate P1's movements.
Not necessary. Not necessary. They can have different dynamics. They can have different payoff functions. Like one player can have slower acceleration than the other player. That can, yeah. So you have the freedom to customize all the details like that. The nice thing is that this game, if you have linear dynamics and a quadratic laws, then this game can be solved analytically. So we can prove that this is actually the Nash equivalent. This is actually the only game with incomplete information where we can solve with an analytical solution. Yeah, so that's why we pick it. So now you have a ground truth. You can compare your numerical solution with the ground truth, right? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, from a value perspective, like I previously said, right? Since this one has an analytical solution, if you look at the value function, so this is a value function in a belief space in a long time. So you can see before roughly 0.5 second, the value is convex, meaning that in this region, regardless of where the belief is, player one should be playing non-revealing. He should not reveal the information. As any revealing of the information gives him a worse value. So here in this case, the smaller the better, okay? But after 0.5 second, the value function becomes concave. So this is when you're gonna convexify this value. And by doing that, you split to these two tips, A and B, meaning that you reveal your information. Does that make sense? Okay, all right. All right, so now we have some comparisons numerically with the state-of-the-art imperfect information solvers from DeepMind. And since our algorithm, we realized that the complexity should not be dependent on the size of the action space, right? Our algorithm is certainly much faster than these other baselines. Most significantly, it's not related to the size of the action space, right? Which is quite straightforward. And with that, we can solve games with longer time steps. But this is still a kind of hard game to solve because you still have continuous state space. So you have to sample all the game states in the entire state space along the game tree. So it still takes a lot of time to do all the minimax problem, the small minimax problems along the way. And then also there's a significant error propagation, which I will skip for now, but if you're interested, I can talk more about that. All right, so we can solve games of either larger scales, and then this is a numerical comparison, numerical results compared with the ground truth. So the significance here is that we can find the policies where the player with information actually understands that he needs to hold that information for a certain amount of time to take advantage of it, right? If you solve it with reinforcement learning, then the agents will just directly go to the target. But here he realized that he needs to hold that information before he moved to the target. So that's the thing. All right, and now we can also solve these games with state constraints. So this is an interesting case with both incomplete information and the state constraint. So this is the attacker. You can imagine that the red line is the attacker, the blue line is the defender. Here's the real target that the attacker is moving to. So he either move to the target and then try to avoid the defender, right? Or he can, with some probability, he will go to the opposite direction and cut back. So this happens when the attacker can actually accelerate faster than the defender. So there's a value in moving in the opposite direction before you cut back. Again, this is because the attacker actually prefers the defender to be, far away from the target. Okay. All right. We can also do what if analysis. So you can say, let's fix the defender, right? And then scan the whole space for the attacker, the initial state of the attacker, and see at each of the locations how long he needs to hold the information. So the higher this value is, the longer he needs to hold the information before he takes a move. Yeah. You can also look at the value of manipulating the belief, right? So this picture here shows the gap between if you play the Nash equilibrium where you manipulate the belief versus if you just play a non-revealing strategy, right? So there's in the middle, there's a higher value to manipulate belief, which means in this case, just hold your information for a certain amount of time before you release it. So.
But this is governed by the state of the dynamics you mentioned, right?
Yeah. This is for this particular game. If you set the dynamics this way, right? Right. Okay. So right now you can see that solving these games is still very expensive because you have to explore from the bottom of the tree and solve these mini-max problems, which are non-convex, non-concave. Okay, so the convergence rate there is sublinear. And then go all the way back. And then, like I said, if the state space is large, you're going to do a lot of examples in the whole space, right? Because the error will propagate. So imagine like in this game, your deceptive motion actually happens at the beginning of the game. So you're going to solve all the way from the back, spend hours of time solving the game all the way to the top of it. And then that's where you realize that your splitting happens at the very beginning, right? So, and if the dynamics of the player change, today you play with this guy, tomorrow you play with the other guy, then you have to resolve the whole game. So there's still a really large gap from the theory to the practice. Also, we're interested in games beyond the current setting, for example, games with general temporal logic specifications. So what if the game is such that you still have state constraint, but if you violate the state constraint, both players have a large penalty, rather than one player wins, the other player loses. In football, if I tackle you, I win, you lose. But for example, in police chasing, if both cars collapse, they collide, and then both people die, no one wins. It's a lose-lose situation, right? Does value exist in the
zero sum then?
This is not zero sum. Yeah, this is only partially zero sum.
Yeah.
So this is only zero sum if there's no collision, right? Okay. So does value exist, and how would the policy look like in this type of games? And if it is to play a general sum, again the same questions, right? And if it's a multiplayer and then general sum, still. So there's a lot of unknowns on the theoretical and the computational side. The takeaway point here is that we now have these embodied AI systems in the real world. So for example, these robots, and they are playing with these cheesy human beings who will try to manipulate them. So how would these robots recognize and defend against this belief manipulation? Of course, you can also pitch from the other side. You want these robots to be cheesy and then try to manipulate the beliefs of human beings. That can also happen if it's a war game. All right, so these are the references and these are the people working on it. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I'm not in the camera, but I invite anyone from the audience to